Emily Dawson had learned to live with the ache. It settled in her chest like the winter chill, numbing, constant, inescapable. She had once believed in love, the kind that lasted, the kind that held on even when things got hard. But last Christmas had taught her differently. Love, it seemed, was conditional, fleeting, something she could never hold on to no matter how much of herself she gave. Now, as she walked through the snow-covered streets of her quiet town, the twinkling Christmas lights felt like a cruel contrast to the emptiness she carried. Everyone else seemed to belong, to families, to friends, to something greater than themselves. But she had never felt more alone. If God was love, why did she feel so unworthy of it? If he cared, why had every prayer she whispered been met with silence? Then, just as she was about to turn away from the small church glowing at the end of the street, a familiar voice called her name. "Emily, dear, won't you come in?" She hesitated. She could keep walking, keep carrying the weight alone, or she could step inside, into the warmth, into the questions she wasn't sure she was ready to face, into the possibility that maybe, just maybe, love had never left her after all. Before we continue with the story, take a moment to subscribe. Grab a coffee or your favorite drink as we journey into the depths of God's love, where faith is tested, prayers are answered in unexpected ways, and miracles unfold when we least expect them. Stay with us, because this story will reveal just how powerful faith can be. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the crisp December air as Emily Dawson pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath forming small clouds in the icy night. The town square shimmered with twinkling lights, the scent of cinnamon and pine lingering from the holiday market, but the warmth of the season barely touched her. Each festive decoration, every joyful laugh from bundled-up families, felt like a quiet mockery of the emptiness she carried inside. She walked without purpose, her boots crunching against the freshly fallen snow, her thoughts tangled in memories she wished she could forget. Last Christmas, she had believed in love, in promises whispered beside a glowing fireplace, in a future she had built in her mind. But love had proven fragile, slipping through her fingers like the melting snowflakes that landed on her skin. She had given too much of herself, only to be left questioning whether she was ever truly worth loving at all. As she passed the small church at the end of the street, a warm light spilled onto the sidewalk from the fellowship hall windows. The faint melody of a choir singing, O come, Emmanuel," drifted through the cold, stirring something deep in her chest, something she quickly silenced. "Emily, dear," a familiar voice called out, and she turned to see Mrs. Carter, wrapped in her usual wool coat, a knitted hat perched on her head. Her eyes filled with the gentle kindness that always made Emily feel seen and unsettled all at once. "It's been too long. Won't you come in for some cider? The Christmas Eve gathering is just starting." Emily hesitated, her fingers curling into fists inside her pockets. She knew the warmth waiting inside, the genuine smiles, the open arms. But she also knew the questions, the concern, the well-meaning words that would remind her of the faith she had once clung to, and the God she wasn't sure still wanted her. "I appreciate it, Mrs. Carter, really, but I should be heading home," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Another time." The older woman didn't press, only nodding with a knowing softness. "You're always welcome, sweetheart, no matter what." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and turned away, quickening her pace as though she could outrun the ache in her chest. The cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones as she moved farther from the church, as if she had walked away from more than just an invitation. Behind her, Mrs. Carter watched her retreating figure, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. Pulling her scarf tighter, she stepped back into the church, her heart burdened with unspoken prayers. "Lord, soften her heart," she whispered, settling into the warmth of the candlelit sanctuary. "Remind her she's never been alone." Emily shut the door to her small apartment. leaning against it as the cold from outside clung to her skin. She exhaled sharply, willing herself to shake off the encounter with Mrs. Carter. But the warmth in the older woman's eyes lingered like an ember she couldn't extinguish. Kicking off her boots, she wandered toward the couch and curled up beneath a worn blanket, staring at the flickering Christmas lights she had half-heartedly strung along the window weeks ago. The glow cast shadows on the walls, stirring memories she wished would stay buried. It had been almost a year since the night that shattered her belief in love, yet the words still echoed, sharp as shattered glass. "You're just too much, Emily. Too emotional. Too complicated. I can't do this anymore." She could still see the way Matthew had stood in the doorway, his suitcase packed, his face void of the tenderness she had once believed in. She had begged him to stay, humiliating herself in the process, because she had given him everything, built her future around him. But in the end, she hadn't been enough. Not for him, not for anyone, not even for God. A lump formed in her throat, and she reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as it lit up with an incoming call. Pastor Daniel. She hesitated, knowing exactly why he was calling. He had left a message the week before, something about checking in, reminding her that the church doors were always open. She had ignored it then, and she ignored it now, letting the phone ring until it fell silent. What would she even say? That she was tired of hoping? That she wasn't sure she believed anymore? That every prayer she had whispered in the past year had been met with silence? She couldn't bear the weight of another conversation where someone told her to trust God's plan, or that everything happened for a reason. She tossed the phone onto the couch beside her, rubbing her arms as if that could chase away the hollow feeling in her chest. The sound of laughter outside drew her attention, and she glanced through the window, watching as a group of people walked past in the snow. Among them, a familiar figure caught her eye. Broad shoulders, an easy smile, hands shoved into his coat pockets like he always had as a teenager. Liam Porter, a name she hadn't thought of in years. He was back. Emily's heart clenched at the sight of him, though she wasn't sure why. They had once been close, before life took them in separate directions. But now, seeing him felt like an intrusion on the carefully built walls around her heart. He had no idea what kind of wreckage he was stepping into. No idea that she had become someone unrecognizable. Tearing her gaze away, she sank deeper into the couch, forcing herself to ignore the strange stirring in her chest. She was done hoping, done believing, and definitely done letting anyone in. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Emily rapped, her hands around her mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Outside, the snow continued to fall in thick, lazy flurries, coating the streets in a pristine white that felt too peaceful for the turmoil brewing inside her. She had come here to escape, to lose herself in the hum of espresso machines and the quiet clatter of cups, to forget the memories that had clawed their way into her mind the night before. But just as she took a sip of her coffee, a familiar voice cut through the background noise. "Emily Dawson?" She stiffened, her grip tightening around the ceramic mug before she looked up. Liam Porter stood a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. His dark eyes held the same warmth she remembered from years ago, though now there was something else, a depth, a steadiness she hadn't noticed before. Liam. The name left her lips before she could decide if she wanted to say it at all. He chuckled, pulling out the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "Didn't think I'd run into you so soon. Thought I might have to track you down at that old bookstore you used to love." Emily forced a small smile, but there was a weight in her chest, an instinct to retreat. "It's been a long time." "It has," Liam agreed, studying her with a quiet curiosity. "How have you been?" It was a simple question, but it felt loaded. She could lie, Tell him she was fine, that life was good. But something about Liam's steady gaze made it hard to pretend. "I've been figuring things out," she said, choosing her words carefully. "And you? What brings you back to town?" He leaned back slightly, as if sensing her reluctance. "Family, mostly. And I'm helping out at the church for the holidays." At the mention of church, Emily's stomach twisted. She nodded but said nothing, hoping he'd let the subject drop. He didn't. "You ever stop by anymore?" he asked, his tone gentle. "Mrs. Carter mentioned she invited you." Emily let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Of course she did." She glanced at him then, searching his face for any trace of judgment. But there was none. Just patience, just understanding. She sighed, stirring her coffee even though it didn't need it. "I don't really do the whole church thing these days." Liam didn't look surprised. "I get it," he said. "But maybe you should. Sometimes when you think God's the furthest away, that's when he's actually right there waiting." Emily looked away, feeling the walls rise instinctively. She wasn't ready for this conversation. Not with him. Not with anyone. "I should get going," she murmured, standing too quickly. Liam didn't push. He just nodded, his voice steady as she walked away. "See you around, Emily." Emily sat cross-legged on the floor of her dimly lit apartment, an old leather-bound journal resting in her lap. The frayed edges and ink-smudged pages were remnants of a girl she barely recognized, one who had once believed in love, in answered prayers, in a God who saw her. She traced a finger over the familiar handwriting, hesitant to turn the page, but the pull of nostalgia was stronger than her resistance. December 20th. "God, I know you have a plan for me. I trust you. I believe you are writing my love story, that you are leading me toward someone who will love me the way you do." A bitter laugh slipped past her lips, sharp and cold. How naive she had been. How foolish. She had prayed those words with such certainty, convinced that faith was enough to protect her from heartbreak, from the pain of being discarded like she was nothing. But where had that trust gotten her? Where was God when Matthew had walked away? Where was he on the nights she had cried herself to sleep, waiting for some sign that she wasn't as unlovable as she felt? Her fingers curled around the edges of the journal, and before she could stop herself, she hurled it across the room. It hit the floor with a dull thud, pages splaying open, exposing the words she no longer believed. Frustration burned in her chest, mingling with an ache so deep it was suffocating. "Why did you let this happen?" she whispered, her voice trembling, barely more than a breath. "Why did you let me believe you were listening?" Silence pressed in around her, thick and unrelenting. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to feel something, anything, beyond the hollow ache in her chest. But there was nothing. No voice from heaven. No sudden peace. Just the empty hum of her apartment and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. A knock at the door startled her, pulling her from the depths of her despair. She hesitated before standing, wiping at her damp cheeks as she opened it. A small envelope lay on the welcome mat, her name scrawled across it in delicate, looping script. Mrs. Carter. Emily's throat tightened as she bent to pick it up, her fingers trembling as she turned it over. She knew without opening it that the words inside would be filled with warmth, with hope, with the kind of faith she no longer had the strength to hold on to. For a moment, she considered tossing it onto the pile of unopened mail on the counter, pretending she had never seen it. But something inside her, a whisper of longing, a flicker of something she couldn't name, made her step back inside, shut the door, and press her back against it. Slowly, hesitantly, she ran her finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter, bracing herself for the words of a woman who still believed in miracles. The scent of chamomile and honey drifted through Mrs. Carter's cozy living room as Emily wrapped her hands around the warm teacup, her gaze fixed on the flickering candle on the table between them. She had only meant to drop by for a quick thank you after receiving the letter, but Mrs. Carter had insisted she stay for tea, her gentle persistence leaving Emily with little room to refuse. Now, she sat across from the older woman, feeling both comforted and unsettled by the kindness in her eyes. "I wasn't always this sure of God's love, you know," Mrs. Carter said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into her tea. "There was a time I thought he had forgotten me completely." Emily glanced up, her curiosity piqued despite herself. She had always known Mrs. Carter as a woman of unwavering faith, a pillar in the church, someone whose joy never seemed to waver. The idea that she had once doubted, that she had once felt abandoned, the way Emily did now, didn't quite fit. "After my husband passed," Mrs. Carter continued, her voice steady but soft, "I spent months crying out to God, asking why he would take away the one person I couldn't imagine living without, and when no answer came, I convinced myself he had stopped listening, that I was alone." Emily swallowed, gripping her cup a little tighter. She knew that feeling too well. "But one day," Mrs. Carter went on, a small smile touching her lips, "I realized that maybe I had been so focused on what I had lost that I couldn't see what God was still giving me. I was waiting for him to speak in the way I wanted, and in doing so, I missed all the ways he was already speaking, through the people who loved me, through the quiet moments of peace, through the strength I didn't think I had, but somehow found anyway." Emily stared down at her tea, her reflection rippling in the golden liquid. She wanted to believe that was true, that God hadn't abandoned her, that maybe she had just stopped looking for him in the right places. But the walls around her heart had been built so high, and she wasn't sure she knew how to let them come down. As if sensing the battle waging inside her, Mrs. Carter reached across the table, her wrinkled hand covering Emily's. "You are not unlovable, Emily, and you are not forgotten." The words settled deep in Emily's chest, uncomfortable yet strangely comforting. She had spent so long believing she wasn't worth loving, by people, by God, that the possibility of being wrong felt almost foreign. Mrs. Carter squeezed her hand gently before pulling back. "Come to the Christmas service," she said, her tone light but hopeful. "No pressure. Just come and see." Emily hesitated but found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "Maybe," she murmured, but the small flicker of warmth in her chest told her it was more than just a maybe. Snow crunched beneath Emily's boots as she walked past the small church, her breath visible in the crisp evening air. The glow of candles in the stained glass windows cast warm colors onto the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the cold she felt pressing against her chest. She had told Mrs. Carter maybe, but now that she was here, standing just steps from the entrance, she couldn't make herself move forward. The thought of walking through those doors, of sitting in the pews where she had once prayed with certainty, felt impossible. What if nothing had changed? What if she walked in and still felt nothing? No presence, no warmth, no reassurance that God was even listening. She tightened her coat around herself, willing her feet to keep moving, to pass the mall church as if it were just another building. But before she could, movement in the courtyard caught her eye. Liam stood outside near a group of children, laughing as he helped a little girl adjust the halo of her angel costume. She couldn't hear what he said, but whatever it was sent the children into a fit of giggles, their joy unfiltered and pure. Emily's chest tightened at the sight. She remembered when church had felt that simple, when faith had been as natural as breathing, when she hadn't questioned whether she was loved, when she had believed without hesitation that God was close. She used to sit in Sunday school, her legs swinging beneath the wooden chairs, listening to Bible stories with wide-eyed wonder. She used to pray without doubting, without second-guessing, without wondering if her words would dissolve into nothing. But life had a way of chipping away at faith, of turning childlike trust into guarded skepticism. She envied the children before her, untouched by the kind of heartbreak that made you question everything you once believed. A lump formed in her throat as she took a slow step back, retreating into the shadows, unseen. Liam glanced toward the street then, his gaze sweeping over the sidewalk, but Emily turned before he could spot her. She wasn't ready for another conversation, for another invitation she wouldn't know how to accept. Instead, she lingered just beyond the churchyard, her back against the cold brick wall, as the first notes of Silent Night drifted through the air. The choir had started rehearsing inside, their voices weaving together in a harmony so gentle, so full of peace, that it made her chest ache. She closed her eyes, letting the melody settle over her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to silence the longing stirring deep within her. She wasn't ready to step inside, not yet. But she wasn't walking away either. And maybe, just maybe, that was something. The steady hum of the cafe's espresso machine filled the air as Emily wiped down the counter, trying to lose herself in the mindless rhythm of work. It was easier to focus on the clatter of cups and the hiss of steaming milk than to dwell on the thoughts that had followed her from the churchyard the night before. But just as she set a clean mug back onto the shelf, a familiar voice interrupted her escape. "Emily." She turned, startled to see Pastor Daniel standing near the register, his kind eyes crinkled in a gentle smile. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you," he said lightly, "but I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop in." Emily forced a polite smile. "Hey, Pastor, can I get you something?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Just a quick visit." His gaze softened. "Mrs. Carter said she saw you the other night. Said you might be thinking about coming to the Christmas service." Emily stiffened, quickly reaching for a rag to occupy her hands. "She assumes a lot." "She does," Pastor Daniel admitted with a chuckle. "But she's usually right." He leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "Emily, I don't know everything you've been through, but I do know this. You are not beyond God's love." A familiar tightness coiled in her chest, that old resistance flaring to life. "That's nice in theory," she muttered, focusing on a coffee stain that wasn't really there. "But some of us don't get that kind of love. Some of us have to earn it, and even then, it's never enough." Pastor Daniel was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card. "That's not true," he said, sliding it across the counter. "And I hope one day you believe that." Emily hesitated before picking it up, her eyes skimming the verse printed in neat, elegant script. "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Romans 8:38-39. Something in her chest clenched, an ache she couldn't name. Could that really be true? A love that didn't depend on how good she was, on how worthy she felt? A love that didn't disappear just because she had stopped believing in it? Her throat tightened, but she masked it with a small scoff, shoving the card into her apron pocket. "I should get back to work." Pastor Daniel didn't push. He simply smiled, stepping back. "Just hold on to it, okay?" As he walked out, Emily pressed a hand against her pocket, feeling the small piece of cardstock against her fingers. She wasn't ready to believe it yet, but she didn't throw it away either. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. Emily scanned the near-empty shelves of the grocery store, her fingers tightening around the handle of her basket. The holiday rush had left the aisles half-stocked, the remnants of Christmas cheer lingering in the form of crushed candy cane boxes and dented cans of cranberry sauce. She sighed, shifting her weight as she reached for a loaf of bread, only to have her hand bump against someone else's. "Oh, sorry," she mumbled, looking up. "Liam." "Of course." He grinned, pulling his hand back as if surrendering the item to her. "We've got to stop meeting like this." She forced a small smile, but there was an unease curling in her chest. She wasn't sure why seeing him again rattled her so much, why he felt like an interruption to the walls she had carefully constructed around herself. "Stocking up for the storm?" he asked, nodding toward the window where fat snowflakes had begun to fall. "Something like that," she said, tucking the bread into her basket. Liam hesitated, studying her for a moment. "Hey, actually, I was going to reach out to you." That got her attention. "To me?" "Yeah." He shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. "The church is doing a Christmas dinner for the community. We could use some extra hands. Thought maybe you'd want to help out." Emily's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of stepping into that church, even just to serve food, made her stomach twist. "I don't know, Liam," she started, already searching for an excuse. But Liam didn't look discouraged. "You don't have to decide right now," he said with an easy shrug. "Just think about it." His lack of pressure threw her off. She had expected him to push, to prod, to remind her that God still loved her and that she belonged in church. Instead, he just stood there, his offer open, but without expectation. Maybe that's why the word slipped out before she could stop. Okay. Liam's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if surprised by her own answer. "Yeah?" "Yeah," she said, though uncertainty clung to the word. "I mean, I guess I can help for a little bit." He smiled, and for a brief second, she felt something shift inside her, something that both scared her and made her feel a little lighter. "Glad to have you," he said, reaching for a bag of coffee before stepping back. "See you Saturday?" She nodded, still unsure why she had agreed. As Liam walked toward the checkout, he glanced back once, his expression thoughtful. And, as he stepped outside into the cold, hands deep in his coat pockets, he whispered a quiet prayer. "God, I don't know what she's holding on to, but I know you do. Just let her see you in all of this." Emily had no idea that prayer was spoken over her. But later that night, as she lay in bed, she found herself still thinking about it. About him. About the church. About the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was meant to say yes. The hum of conversation filled the church fellowship hall, blending with the clatter of serving spoons and the occasional burst of laughter from the children's table. Emily stood behind the buffet line, ladling mashed potatoes onto plates, feeling strangely out of place yet oddly grounded at the same time. The warmth of the room, both from the crowded space and the kindness radiating from the volunteers, wrapped around her like a soft embrace. Though she wasn't sure she was ready to receive it, she had expected to feel like an outsider, to be met with questioning glances, but no one treated her like she didn't belong. Instead, Liam had greeted her with an easy smile when she arrived, handing her an apron as if she had always been, meant to be there. Mrs. Carter had squeezed her hand, offering nothing but gentle encouragement. And now, here she was, serving food to people who barely knew her, but accepted her without hesitation. "Thank you, miss." A little girl with curly pigtails beamed up at her as Emily placed a roll on her plate. Before Emily could respond, the child suddenly wrapped her small arms around her waist in a quick but fierce hug. "You're really kind." Emily froze, the unexpected words hitting deeper than they should have. Kind? She wanted to believe that, but the voice in her head, the one that echoed past rejections and mistakes, told her otherwise. Kindness belonged to people like Mrs. Carter, to people who never doubted, never wavered, not to people like her. And yet, this little girl, pure, unfiltered, untouched by cynicism, saw something in her. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Emily hesitantly placed a hand on the child's back. "You're very kind too," she whispered. The girl grinned before skipping off to her seat, completely unaware of the storm she had stirred in Emily's heart. As Emily continued serving, she found herself watching the room, really watching, seeing the way volunteers laughed together, the way Pastor Daniel knelt beside an elderly man, speaking with a gentleness that could only be described as love. She saw Liam at the other end of the hall, kneeling to tie a young boy's shoelaces, his expression full of patient care. None of them were here because they had to be. They were here because they wanted to be. Because love, real love, was not about being good enough. It was simply given, freely, unearned, undeserved. Her fingers brushed against the pocket of her jeans, where Pastor Daniel's scripture card still rested. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. The words resurfaced in her mind, unbidden, yet persistent. She had spent so long believing she was unworthy, so long thinking love was something to earn. But what if, just what if, she had been wrong? As she filled another plate, a quiet thought surfaced, one she hadn't dared entertain in a long time. God, do you really see me this way? Emily barely noticed the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, or even the warmth of the fellowship hall anymore. The little girl's hug had left an unfamiliar softness in her chest, a flicker of something she wasn't ready to name. But all of it, the fragile hope, the small moments of kindness, came crashing down the moment she heard his voice. Didn't expect to see you here. The words were laced with surprise, but not the good kind. Emily turned slowly, her stomach twisting as she met the familiar smirk of Jason Turner. He had been Matthew's friend, an old acquaintance from a life she'd rather forget. "Church girl again, huh?" He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Guess some people never learn." Emily stiffened. "Excuse me?" Jason leaned against the table, his eyes scanning her like he was trying to figure her out. "Come on, Emily. You really think this changes anything? You think volunteering at a church dinner makes you a different person? Makes you worthy?" The air felt too thick, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She hadn't thought about Matthew in weeks, but suddenly, every ugly memory resurfaced, his indifference, his words when he left. "You're too much, Emily, too emotional, too complicated." And now here was Jason, confirming what she had always feared. Nothing she did would ever be enough to change who she was. She turned away sharply, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Emily." Liam's voice was somewhere behind her, concerned, questioning, but she didn't stop. She pushed through the doors and into the cold night, the sharp wind biting against her skin as she hurried down the street. The warmth of the church, the kindness, the fragile sense of belonging. She had been stupid to let herself believe in any of it, stupid to think that she could rewrite the truth of who she was. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she reached a darkened alley between two buildings, pressing her back against the brick wall as her emotions exploded inside her. "God, what do you want from me?" Her voice broke into the empty night, raw and desperate. "I tried. I came. I showed up. Isn't that enough?" The silence that followed was unbearable. No voice, no comfort, just the distant sound of wind, rustling through bare trees. Her hands clenched into fists, anger and hurt clawing their way to the surface. "You don't care," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "You never did." A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly swiped it away. She had let herself hope, and this was what it got her. Pain, rejection, silence. With a heavy breath, she pushed off the wall and started walking, further and further from the church, from the people who had tried to care, from the God who refused to answer. She wouldn't make this mistake again. She was done hoping, done believing. And this time, she meant it. "We carefully crafted this story, and we truly appreciate your support. More than that, we've prayed that the Holy Spirit will touch your heart in ways only He can. subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone you love. Now, let's return to the story. Emily sat curled up on her couch, staring at the dim glow of her Christmas tree, its soft lights flickering against the darkened room. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing the world in an untouched white, but inside, everything felt heavy, suffocating. Her phone vibrated again on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with Liam's name. Then, almost immediately after, another notification. Missed call, Mrs. Carter. Emily clenched her jaw and turned the phone over, blocking out the persistent reminders that someone still cared. But she didn't want their concern, didn't want the pity disguised as kindness. What good was any of it when she still felt like she was drowning? The cruel words from the night before still echoed in her mind, looping over and over like a broken record. You really think this changes anything? Maybe Jason had been right. Maybe nothing she did could undo what she was. Too much, too broken, too undeserving of the love she had dared to hope for. Pulling her knees to her chest, she buried her face in her arms, squeezing her eyes shut against the ache welling inside. Her. The silence in the room pressed down on her, thick and inescapable, as if even God had turned away. "Why do you keep doing this to me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "Why do you keep letting me believe things will change?" The words felt small in the emptiness, and she hated how desperate they sounded. She had spent so long trying to be strong, to convince herself she didn't care anymore. But right now, in the dim glow of the tree, she couldn't keep pretending. She exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening into the fabric of her sweater. "If you're really there, if you really care at all, prove it." The demand slipped from her lips before she could stop it, raw and unfiltered. She wasn't sure what she expected, some miraculous sign, some overwhelming feeling of peace, but all she got was silence. The same silence she had been met with for months, the same silence that had filled the spaces where she had once believed God would answer. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head as fresh tears burned her eyes. "That's what I thought." She wiped her face roughly and stood, moving toward the window, pressing a hand against the cold glass. The snow outside was still falling, slow and steady, covering everything in its path. For a moment, she wished she could be like that, untouched, unbothered, free from the weight of all she carried. But she wasn't. And maybe she never would be. Turning away from the window, she grabbed a blanket and sank back onto the couch, pulling it over herself like a shield. She was done reaching out, done asking for answers that never came. If God wanted her to believe he loved her, he would have to make the next move, because she had nothing left to give. A soft knock at the door pulled Emily from the haze of her thoughts. She considered ignoring it, just like she had ignored the phone calls, the texts, the world outside these four walls. But something in her wouldn't let her. With a heavy sigh, she shuffled to the door and cracked it open, only to find Mrs. Carter standing there, bundled in her wool coat, a gentle smile on her face. "I know I'm not invited," the older woman said lightly, "but I thought I'd take my chances." Emily sighed, stepping back just enough to let her in. "You're persistent," she muttered. "You say that like it's a bad thing," Mrs. Carter replied, unwrapping her scarf. "I brought you something." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small book, placing it carefully onto the coffee table. Emily glanced at the cover. Loved Beyond Measure, Finding Your Worth in Christ. She swallowed hard, already feeling the walls inside her rising. "Mrs. Carter, I don't have to say anything," Mrs. Carter interrupted kindly. "Just read the first page. That's all I ask." Emily's fingers hovered over the book before she let out a quiet breath and picked it up. The pages were soft, well-worn, like they had been read 100 times before. She flipped to the first one, her eyes skimming the words. Before you ever spoke a word, before you ever made a mistake, before you ever questioned your worth, God called you His. Not because you earned it. Not because you were perfect, but because His love has never been about you being enough. It has always been about Him being enough. Her throat tightened. She closed the book quickly, setting it down as if it had burned her. It's nice, she said, forcing indifference into her tone. But Mrs. Carter wasn't fooled. You don't believe it yet, she said gently. That's all right. Belief doesn't always come in an instant. Sometimes it starts with just letting the words sit with you. Emily looked away, arms crossed, over her chest. She wanted to reject it outright, to tell Mrs. Carter that she was wasting her time, but the truth was, she didn't want to let go of the book. She didn't want to admit that something about those words had struck a chord deep within her. Her fingers brushed absent-mindedly against her pocket, where the scripture card from Pastor Daniel still rested. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. She had dismissed those words before, but now, sitting in this quiet room with Mrs. Carter's unwavering kindness, she wasn't so sure. Mrs. Carter stood, giving Emily's hand a small squeeze. Keep the book, just in case. And with that, she left, the door clicking softly behind her. Emily stared at the book for a long time before picking it up again, her walls still intact, but maybe, just maybe, with the first small crack forming. The afternoon was gray. The sky stretched tight with unfallen snow as Emily walked along the quiet streets, lost in thought. She hadn't meant to bring the devotional with her, but somehow, it sat tucked inside her bag, its presence an unspoken challenge she wasn't ready to acknowledge. She wasn't even sure why she was out. Maybe to clear her head, maybe to outrun the weight pressing on her chest. Either way, she wasn't expecting to hear her name. Emily? She turned, and there he was again, Liam Porter, standing just outside a corner cafe, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his face lit with something that looked suspiciously like relief. Hey, he said, stepping closer, his breath curling in the cold air. You okay? The question caught her off guard. People always asked how she was, but rarely did anyone seem to actually want the answer. She almost brushed it off with a practiced "I'm fine." But something in Liam's gaze, steady, patient, made her hesitate. Not really, she admitted quietly. He nodded, as if he already knew. Come on, he said, motioning toward the cafe behind him. Let me buy you a coffee. She should have said no. She wasn't in the mood for company. And yet, she found herself following him inside, the warmth of the shop wrapping around her like a soft embrace. They settled into a corner booth, and for a few minutes, there was only the sound of clinking, mugs, and the low hum of conversation around them. Then Liam spoke. You know, he said, wrapping his hands around his coffee, there was a time I thought God had given up on me. Emily frowned, caught off guard by his words. You? She asked skeptically. You're like the church guy. He chuckled, shaking his head. Not always. I spent years trying to outrun him. I got hurt, I got angry, and I figured if God really loved me, he wouldn't have let it happen. His expression grew distant, the weight of old wounds flickering across his face. But the thing about God is, he doesn't stop pursuing you, even when you push him away. Emily looked down at her cup, his words stirring something uncomfortable in her chest. And you just believe that? She asked, her voice quieter now. Liam shrugged. Not at first. But little things kept happening. Things I couldn't explain away. People showing up at the right moment. Words I needed to hear. Peace in places I shouldn't have felt it. I started realizing that maybe he never left. Maybe I was just too hurt to see him. He looked at her then, his voice gentle. I think he's still pursuing you, Emily. She swallowed hard, feeling something shift inside her, something too fragile to name. Before she could stop herself, she whispered, I don't know. Liam smiled. That's okay. He hesitated, then asked, Would you come to church this Sunday just once? Emily bit her lip, the old resistance rising, except this time, it wasn't so strong. Finally, she exhaled. Just once. Emily sat rigidly in the pew, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. The soft hum of conversation filled the sanctuary, the scent of old wood and candle wax hanging in the air. But none of it felt familiar anymore. It had been years since she had last sat in this church, years since she had believed she belonged here. Now, surrounded by people who seemed so at ease in their faith, she felt exposed, as if every doubt, every wound, every unanswered prayer was written across her face. She shouldn't have come. This was a mistake. But then, Pastor Daniel stepped up to the pulpit, and his warm voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Today, we're talking about the prodigal son. Emily stiffened. She had heard the story before, probably more times than she could count. A son who took his inheritance, ran away, lost everything, and finally, with nowhere else to go, returned home expecting rejection. And yet, his father had run to him, embraced him, celebrated him. She had always thought it was a beautiful story. For other people, not for her. Pastor Daniel's voice was steady, full of quiet conviction. Some of us know what it's like to run, he said. To believe that we've wandered too far, that we've wasted too much, that we don't deserve to come home. Maybe you think God is waiting for you with disappointment, with a list of everything you've done wrong. But that's not the God we serve. The father in this story didn't just allow his son to return. He ran to him, arms open, before the son could even finish his apology. A lump formed in Emily's throat, arms open. She couldn't remember the last time she had thought of God that way. For so long she had pictured him as distant, silent, withholding. Just another presence in her life that had turned away when she needed him most. But what if she had been wrong? What if he had been waiting for her all along? A rush of emotions swelled in her chest. Conviction, longing, fear, hope, so tangled together that she couldn't separate one from the other. Her mind fought against it, against the fragile hope threatening to take root. If that's true, then why do I still feel so lost? She stole a glance at Liam beside her, but he wasn't looking at her, just listening, his expression peaceful, as if he had once wrestled with these same doubts and had come out the other side believing. Emily exhaled shakily, dropping her gaze. She wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But as the sermon continued, Pastor Daniel's words settled deep within her, lingering in the quiet places of her heart. Maybe you think you don't deserve to come home. But the truth is, the Father has already been waiting for you. And for the first time in a long time, Emily wondered if that could be true. Emily kept her head down as the service continued, half expecting the weight in her chest to subside now that Pastor Daniel had finished his sermon. But the words still lingered, pressing against the cracks in her heart like water searching for a way through. She should have left when the final prayer was spoken, should have slipped out before anyone noticed she was there. But something held her in place. As if sensing her hesitation, Liam didn't move either, his quiet presence beside her both grounding and unsettling. Then a woman stepped forward to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted it. I wasn't planning to share this today, she admitted, her voice soft yet steady. But as Pastor Daniel spoke, I felt like God was nudging me to tell my story. Emily tensed, something in her gut telling her to listen. The woman took a breath. I know what it's like to believe you're not enough. I spent years convinced that I was unlovable, that every rejection, every heartbreak, was proof that something was wrong with me. I let it shape the way I saw myself, the way I saw God. Emily's pulse quickened, her fingers curling against the hem of her sweater. She knew this story. Not this woman specifically, but the feeling, the gnawing ache of not being wanted, of being left behind, of being convinced that if people walked away, then God must have too. But one day, the woman continued, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, I realized something. My worth was never tied to how others treated me. It wasn't dependent on who stayed or who left. It had always been in God. And He never once walked away. Emily swallowed hard, her throat burning. What if that was true for me too? The thought sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over her, and she pressed her lips together, trying to push it down. But she couldn't. Because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe she was more than the men who had left, more than the loneliness, more than the doubts that had wrapped themselves around her heart. The woman glanced around the room, her voice thick with emotion. If you've ever felt unworthy, if you've ever questioned if you were truly loved, I want you to know that you are, more than you could ever imagine. The hush that fell over the sanctuary was almost suffocating, but Emily barely noticed. Her hands trembled as she gripped the back of the pew, her chest tight, her heart hammering. And then, before she could think, before she could let fear stop her, she stayed. She stayed as people rose for prayer, as hands lifted, as whispered petitions filled the space. She stayed, even as the ache in her heart threatened to break her wide open, because something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, she was meant to hear those words today. And maybe, just maybe, God was trying to reach her after all. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, an old shoebox in front of her, its corners frayed from years of being shuffled between closets and storage bins. She hadn't meant to go through it tonight. She had only been looking for a spare pen when she stumbled across the familiar box, buried beneath stacks of papers she had long ignored. Something about it made her pause, a whisper of longing stirring in her chest. Slowly, she lifted the lid, her fingers sifting through faded photographs, childhood trinkets, and forgotten birthday cards. And then she saw it, a pale blue envelope, with her name scrawled in delicate cursive. Her breath caught. Grandma. Hands trembling, she pulled it out, carefully unfolding the yellowed paper inside. The date in the corner was from years ago, long before life had hardened her heart. My dearest Emily, the letter began, I don't know when you'll read this, but I pray that when you do, you will know how deeply you are loved, not just by me, but by the one who formed you, who calls you by name, who delights in you more than you could ever comprehend. Emily swallowed hard, already feeling the sting of tears. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, warm and unwavering, the same voice that used to read her Bible stories at bedtime, the same voice that had once told her that God would never leave her, no matter how far she ran. I know life isn't always easy, sweetheart. There will be days when you doubt, when you wonder if God sees you, if He hears you. But I need you to remember this. His love for you isn't based on how strong your faith is. It isn't based on how perfect you are or how many mistakes you've made. It's based on Him. And He does not change. A tear slipped down her cheek as she traced the ink with her fingers. She had spent so long convinced that she had wandered too far, that her doubts and anger had built a wall too high for God to climb. But her grandmother had known, even then, that she would struggle, that she would need to be reminded. When you feel lost, open His word. He is there, always. Emily let out a shaky breath, her gaze drifting toward the unopened Bible on her bookshelf, covered in dust, untouched for years. Her grandmother had believed those words with all her heart. Once upon a time, I did too. Before she could talk herself out of it, she rose to her feet, stepping toward the shelf. She hesitated for only a moment before pulling the Bible down, running a hand over the worn leather cover. Then, with a deep breath, she opened it. The pages crinkled softly as she flipped through them, searching, not just for words, but for something deeper. Something she had lost. Something she was finally ready to find again. Emily sat at her small kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper in front of her, and a pen clenched tightly in her fingers. The Bible from earlier lay open beside her, the familiar weight of it pressing against her arm. She had read and reread the letter from her grandmother, let the words seep into the cracks of her heart. But something inside her still resisted. What if it wasn't true for me? The question gnawed at her, but another thought followed, softer yet persistent. What if it was? Taking a slow breath, she pressed the tip of the pen to the page, hesitating before writing the first words. Lies. I have believed. The ink looked stark against the white paper, and for a moment, she considered stopping, closing the notebook, pretending she didn't feel this pull inside her. But then, slowly, the words began to pour out. I am not enough. I am unlovable. I will always be abandoned. God has forgotten me. I have to be perfect to be accepted. No one will ever stay. Her hands shook as she wrote, each sentence like a wound reopened, but she forced herself to keep going until the page was full. When she finally set the pen down, she stared at the list, her chest tightening. These lies had shaped her for so long, whispered in the dark corners of her heart, dictating the way she saw herself, the way she saw God. But what if they weren't true? Her fingers brushed against the open Bible, and her eyes landed on the verse she had read earlier. You are precious and honored in my sight, and because I love you. Isaiah 43:4. Precious, honored, loved. The words felt foreign, almost impossible. Yet something deep inside her ached to believe them. With a sudden surge of determination, she grabbed the paper, gripping it tightly before tearing it straight down the middle. The sound echoed in the quiet room, and she did it again, and again, until the lies lay in shreds across the table. God, she whispered, her voice unsteady. I don't know how to believe the truth, but I want to. The admission came with an unexpected flood of emotion, tears slipping down her cheeks as she bowed her head. I've spent so long thinking you didn't care, thinking I wasn't worth loving. But if you're still here, if you really do love me, help me see it. The words broke something open inside her, something she had been holding on to for years. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't just speaking to the silence. She was reaching, truly reaching, for God. And though there was no booming voice, no sudden revelation, a quiet peace settled over her, like the gentlest whisper of reassurance. She wiped at her eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a perfect faith, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Emily sat on Mrs. Carter's couch, a steaming mug of tea warming her hands as she listened to the older woman and Liam share stories she hadn't expected to hear. The snow outside cast a quiet glow through the window, but inside, the conversation was anything but cold. I used to believe I wasn't enough for God, Liam admitted, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. His voice was steady, but there was something raw in his tone. I thought, if I wasn't perfect, if I made too many mistakes, he'd stop caring. So I ran. I tried to fill the emptiness with everything except him. And when that didn't work, I convinced myself that he had given up on me. Emily's fingers tightened around her mug. I know that feeling. Mrs. Carter nodded knowingly, her gentle gaze resting on Liam. And yet, here you are, she said with a smile. Because he never gave up on you. Liam chuckled softly, shaking his head. No, he didn't. He kept showing up. Through people, through small moments, through things I couldn't explain away. And eventually, I stopped running long enough to see it. He looked at Emily then, not with pity, not with expectation, but with something else. Understanding. That's how God loves us, Emily. Not in grand gestures or booming voices from the sky, but in the quiet ways he reminds us he's near. Emily swallowed hard, her heart twisting at his words. She had spent so long searching for proof, for some undeniable sign that God hadn't left her. But what if she had been looking for the wrong thing? Mrs. Carter's voice broke the silence, warm and full of conviction. I used to beg God to show me his love in ways I could understand. And you know how he answered? She reached out and patted Emily's hand. Through people. Through kindness I didn't deserve. Through love that didn't let go. Even when I tried to push it away. Emily blinked rapidly, her vision blurring. Because hadn't she experienced that too? Liam's patience, Mrs. Carter's unwavering kindness, even Pastor Daniel's simple scripture card. They were all pieces of something bigger, something she had refused to see. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it, and for the first time in years she didn't hide it. I don't know how to stop feeling like I'm not enough, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to believe he still wants me. Mrs. Carter squeezed her hand gently. Then don't try to figure it all out at once. Just let him love you, sweetheart. Let yourself see it. Emily let out a shaky breath, nodding as more tears fell, because maybe, just maybe, God had been showing her his love all along. And maybe, for the first time, she was finally ready to receive it. Emily stood at the doorway of Mrs. Carter's home, fingers curled around the handle of her mug, staring down into the remnants of her tea. The warmth of the small house wrapped around her like a soft embrace, but inside, she felt the familiar tug of hesitation, of uncertainty. She had opened up more than she ever intended to, allowed words she had buried deep to slip past her lips. And now, she wasn't sure what to do with the emotions that remained. Mrs. Carter and Liam had spent the past hour sharing their stories, speaking of God's love, as if it were something real, something tangible, something already surrounding her even when she couldn't see it. And maybe, just maybe, some part of her wanted to believe them. Emily, dear. Mrs. Carter's voice was gentle as she reached across the table, laying a soft hand on Emily's. I know this is a big step, but I wanted to invite you to the Christmas Eve service at church. It's a beautiful night. Candlelight, carols, a time of reflection. You don't have to do anything. Just come. Emily's heart clenched. She should say no. She wasn't ready. The church still felt too big, too overwhelming, too full of expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. And yet when she opened her mouth, the word that came out was, okay. Liam, who had been leaning back in his chair, straightened slightly, his expression unreadable. Yeah? Yeah, Emily repeated, almost as if she needed to convince herself. I mean, I guess I can go. Just for a little while. Mrs. Carter beamed. That's all I ask. Emily forced a smile in return, but inside, fear curled in her chest. She had agreed without fully understanding why, without knowing what she expected to find in that sanctuary on Christmas Eve. Would she feel something? Would she hear from God? Or would she just sit in the pew, surrounded by believers, feeling as lost as ever? Later that night, alone in her apartment, she sat in the quiet, staring at the Christmas lights glowing softly along the window. God, she started, but she didn't know how to finish. She didn't know what to say, what to ask, what to hope for. Did he really see her? Did he care? Or was she just another face in the crowd, one he had already forgotten? She sighed, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, staring at the invitation Mrs. Carter had written down for her, the words, "Christmas Eve candlelight service" standing out beneath the golden glow of the lights. Maybe she wouldn't find answers there. Maybe she would sit through the entire thing and still feel just as lost. But she was going. And somehow, that felt like something. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the sanctuary walls as Emily sat alone in the pew, the distant hum of Christmas Eve lingering in the stillness. The service had ended over an hour ago, the last of the congregation filing out into the crisp winter night. But she had stayed behind, unable to shake the weight pressing against her heart. She had spent the evening feeling like an observer, watching as others sang with conviction, prayed with certainty, and rested in a faith she still couldn't fully grasp. And yet, something about the way the candlelight had illuminated their faces, the way their voices had risen in unison to "O Holy Night," had stirred something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore. Now, in the silence, she traced her fingers over the wooden pew, her gaze drifting toward the large, open Bible near the altar. A pull, gentle but firm, urged her forward. She hesitated only a moment before standing, her footsteps quiet against the worn carpet as she approached. The pages lay open, waiting, and as she lowered herself onto the front pew, her eyes fell on the words printed before her. "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine." Isaiah 43:1. Emily inhaled sharply, the words striking her like a whisper straight to her soul. "I have summoned you by name. You are mine." Her fingers trembled as she traced the verse, her chest tightening with something she couldn't name. Something vast and overwhelming, yet strangely gentle. She had spent so long wondering if God saw her, if he had turned away, if she had wandered too far to ever come home. And yet, here was his answer. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't abandoned. She was his. A sob broke free from her throat before she could stop it, her shoulders shaking as the weight she had carried for so long, years of rejection, of loneliness, of believing she was unloved, began to fall away. It wasn't an audible voice, no booming revelation from the heavens, but in the stillness of the empty church, she knew he had never left. He had been here all along, waiting, calling, loving her, even in her doubt, even in her anger, even in her silence. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she felt like she had been holding for years. "God," she whispered, her voice trembling, raw, real. "I believe you see me." The words settled deep inside her, not just as a fleeting hope, but as truth. And for the first time in a long time, peace, pure and undeniable, washed over her like a wave. Slowly she wiped her tears, taking one last look at the words before her. Then, with a quiet certainty she hadn't felt in years, she rose and stepped out into the cold, walking into the night, no longer lost, but found. The soft glow of Christmas morning filtered through Emily's window, casting golden streaks across her bedroom walls. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she awoke without the crushing weight of doubt pressing against her chest. The silence of the early hours wasn't empty. It was peaceful. She stretched beneath the warmth of her blankets, savoring the unfamiliar stillness in her soul. It felt fragile, like the first snowfall of the season, but it was real. As she sat up, her gaze landed on the open Bible on her nightstand, right where she had left it the night before. The pages were still turned to Isaiah 43:1. With hesitant fingers, she reached for it, letting her eyes skim over the words that had undone her, that had mended something deep inside her. "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine." A breath shuddered from her lips, and before she could second-guess herself, she whispered the words that had been stirring in her heart since last night. "I am yours, Lord." The admission felt both foreign and familiar, like something she had known once, but had forgotten along the way. A quiet warmth spread through her. Not a grand, overwhelming moment, but a steady assurance, like the kind Mrs. Carter had spoken of, like the peace Liam had found. Her doubts weren't entirely gone. She still had questions, still wrestled with the years of believing she had been alone. But for the first time, the questions didn't feel like walls shutting her out. They felt like an invitation, a knock at her heart, waiting to be answered. She traced the edges of the Bible, her thoughts shifting. For so long, church had felt like a place of obligation, a reminder of all the ways she didn't measure up. But now, something was different. She didn't have to go. She wanted to, not to prove anything, not to fit into a mold she had never felt worthy of, but to know more, to step further into this faith that had pursued her even when she had run. She reached for her phone, her heart pounding slightly as she typed out a message to Liam. "Are you going to church today?" The reply came almost instantly. Wouldn't miss it. "Want to come?" She hesitated only a moment before responding. "Yeah, I think I do." Setting her phone down, she exhaled slowly, letting herself lean into the newness of it all. The doubts, the uncertainty, the quiet faith blooming where hopelessness had once lived. Today wasn't about having it all figured out. It was about taking a step. And for the first time in years, she was ready. With one last glance at Isaiah 43:1, she smiled to herself, then got up to begin a Christmas morning unlike any she had ever known. The church doors felt heavier than Emily remembered, or maybe it was just the weight of stepping through them after so many years. She hesitated on the threshold, her pulse quickening as she glanced inside. People filled the sanctuary, their voices blending into a low hum of laughter and conversation. The warmth of the space, the flickering candles, the scent of pine lingering from the Christmas Eve service was inviting. But still, that familiar whisper of doubt lingered in the back of her mind. "You don't belong here." Before she could entertain the thought, a voice called her name. "Emily, dear." Mrs. Carter's face lit up as she bustled toward her, wrapping her in a hug before she could protest. "I knew you'd come." Emily let out a breath, some of her tension melting in the older woman's embrace. "It's good to see you," she admitted. Before she could say more, Liam appeared beside her, grinning. Look who decided to show up. His teasing was light, but there was something else in his expression. Something like pride, like encouragement. Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't fight the small smile tugging at her lips. "Don't make a big deal out of it." "Too late." He nudged her playfully before motioning toward the pews. "Come on, we saved you a seat." Taking a steadying breath, Emily followed them inside, slipping into the familiar wooden pews as the service began. Pastor Daniel stepped forward, his voice carrying warmth as he spoke. "Today's message is about new beginnings," he said. "About what it means to be made new in Christ." Emily's heart clenched at the words, her fingers tightening in her lap. New. Could that really be her? Pastor Daniel continued, reading from 2 Corinthians 5:17. "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here." She swallowed hard, staring down at her hands. For so long, she had let her past define her, let her failures and heartbreaks convince her that she wasn't worthy of anything good. But what if she had been wrong? What if God's love had never been about what she could or couldn't do, but simply about who He was? Her chest tightened and she exhaled shakily. The old had gone. Not because she had fixed herself, but because God had never stopped reaching for her, never stopped calling her his. As the service went on, something stirred deep within her, something more than just emotion. A pull, a quiet, undeniable nudge. Share your story. The thought terrified her. She wasn't ready, was she? But even as doubt whispered, another voice, softer, steadier, reminded her of the truth. You are already loved. You are already new. As the final worship song played, Emily closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, knowing one thing for certain. She wasn't just here to sit in the pews. God was calling her to something more. The cafe was quiet in the late afternoon, the scent of roasted coffee beans mixing with the faint sound of Christmas music playing over the speakers. Emily sat across from Liam, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, but the heat did little to steady the nerves twisting in her stomach. She had agreed to meet him after church, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was because of the way he had looked at her during the service, not with pity, not with expectation, but with the kind of understanding that made her feel safe. Maybe it was because something inside her wanted to talk, even if the thought terrified her. Liam took a sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. You've been quiet, he said gently. What's on your mind? Emily let out a slow breath, staring into the dark liquid in her cup as if it might hold the answer. I don't really talk about this stuff, she admitted. I guess I'm just used to keeping it to myself. Liam nodded, no pressure in his expression, just quiet patience. That makes sense, but you don't have to. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. For so long, her pain had felt like something she had to carry alone, something no one else could understand. But if she was ever going to move forward, she had to let the walls crack, even just a little. I've spent a long time believing I wasn't enough, she finally said, her voice quieter now. That love was something I had to earn, and no matter how hard I tried, I always seemed to fall short. The words felt foreign on her tongue, raw and unpolished, but she didn't stop. Matthew, he left because I was too much, too emotional, too complicated. And for a long time, I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't worth staying for. Liam's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her release words she had buried for far too long. And not just with him, she continued, shaking her head. Even with God. I thought if I didn't have it all together, if I doubted too much, he'd leave too. A deep breath. A shaky exhale. That's why I ran. Liam leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. But he didn't leave Emily. His words hung between them, simple yet profound. God doesn't walk away because we're messy. He redeems the broken things. That's kind of his specialty. Something in her chest shifted at those words, something long buried but now stirring back to life. Vulnerability had always felt dangerous, but maybe, just maybe, it was the only way forward. She glanced at Liam, a question forming in her heart. If God could redeem her story, did that mean she needed to start making peace with it? The thought lingered as she sipped her coffee, the idea of reconciliation, of forgiveness, both terrifying and freeing. Maybe it was time to stop running. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft scratching of Emily's pen against the paper. She sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of her lamp casting long shadows across the room, her heart pounding with every word she wrote. She hadn't planned on doing this. Not really. The idea had lingered in the back of her mind ever since her conversation with Liam, but she had pushed it away, unwilling to face what it meant. And yet, here she was, writing a letter she never expected to write. Matthew, she started, hesitating, before forcing herself to continue. I don't know why I'm doing this. Maybe for closure, maybe just for myself. But there are things I need to say. Things I've carried for too long. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam. You hurt me. You made me believe I wasn't enough, that I was too much, too complicated to love. And I let that define me. I let your words become my truth. But I can't do that anymore. She swallowed hard, blinking against the sting of tears. I spent so long being angry, resenting you, resenting myself, but holding on to this bitterness hasn't healed me. It's only kept me stuck. And I don't want to be stuck anymore. So I'm choosing to let go. I'm choosing to forgive you. She paused, exhaling shakily, staring at the sentence she never thought she'd write. Not because you deserve it. Not because I'm excusing what happened, but because I deserve to be free. A tear slipped onto the page, smudging the ink slightly, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it stay, a quiet testament to the weight she was finally releasing. I hope you're doing well. I hope you found peace. And I hope, one day, I'll fully step into mine too. She signed her name, then set the pen down, her hands trembling. For a long moment, she simply stared at the letter, wondering if she should send it. Would he even care? Would it change anything? Slowly, she shook her head. This wasn't about him. It had never been about him. It was about her, about healing, about trusting that God was doing something new in her, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. Instead of folding it into an envelope, she pressed her palms over the paper, closing her eyes. God, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to do this, but I'm giving this to you. I'm done holding on to this hurt. Help me to really let it go. The words were raw, unpolished, but they were real. And as she whispered amen, something inside her shifted. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't magic. But for the first time, the anger, the pain, the heaviness that had once felt immovable, felt just a little lighter. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see herself the way God had seen her all along. Free. The church basement buzzed with quiet activity as volunteers moved between tables, stacking donated coats, filling plates with warm food, and offering kind smiles to the weary faces that had gathered. Emily stood beside Mrs. Carter, ladling soup into bowls, the simple rhythm keeping her grounded. She hadn't been sure what to expect when she agreed to help at the outreach event. But as she watched families shuffle in, some with tired eyes, some with hesitant smiles, some with the unmistakable weight of struggle, she realized something. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about herself. She wasn't lost in the constant hum of doubt, the ache of rejection. She was here, fully present, offering warmth in the form of a meal, a smile, a moment of kindness. And somehow, that felt like enough. Miss? A small voice tugged at her attention. Emily looked down to find a little girl, no older than 6, peering up at her with wide, searching eyes. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, her dark curls slightly tangled, but it was the uncertainty in her expression that hit Emily the hardest. Hey, sweetheart, Emily said gently, crouching down to her level. Are you hungry? The girl hesitated before nodding, but instead of taking the bowl Emily offered, she suddenly stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around Emily's waist. The hug was fierce, unexpected, and it stole the breath from Emily's lungs. For a second she froze, overwhelmed by the child's desperate grip. Then, slowly, she returned the embrace, her heart twisting at the unspoken pain behind it. She hasn't said much, a volunteer whispered nearby. Her mother dropped her off earlier and didn't come back. Emily's throat tightened, the weight of those words settling deep in her chest. Left behind, unwanted, forgotten. She knew those feelings too well. Gently, she pulled back just enough to look the little girl in the eyes. "You're safe here," she said softly. "You're not alone." The girl didn't respond, just buried her face against Emily's shoulder, and something inside her cracked wide open. This was why she was here, not just in this moment, but in life. She had spent years believing her brokenness made her unworthy, that her pain was proof she had been abandoned by both people and God. But now, as she held this fragile child in her arms, she saw the truth. Her pain had not been wasted. It had made her tender, understanding, able to recognize the hurt in others and meet it with love. Maybe that was what God had been trying to show her all along. As she rocked the little girl gently, a quiet realization settled over her. I am not my past. I am not my rejection. I am loved, and I am meant to love others. For the first time, she began to wonder what a future rooted in that truth might look like. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Emily hesitated in front of the small townhouse, her breath curling in the crisp winter air. She hadn't been here in over a year, hadn't knocked on this door since she had pulled away from everyone who once cared about her. The guilt settled heavy in her chest. But deeper than that, there was something else. Hope. A quiet nudge telling her this was the next step. She took a steadying breath and knocked. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, revealing a familiar face. Megan, her old roommate. The friend who had once known every corner of her heart, before Emily had shut her out. Megan's blue eyes widened in shock. "Emily?" Emily swallowed, forcing a small smile. "Hey." Silence stretched between them, and Emily braced herself for the coldness she deserved. But instead, Megan stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." The warmth of the house wrapped around her as she stepped inside, and for a moment, all the memories came rushing back. Late-night talks, shared laughter, Megan sitting beside her after Matthew left, offering comfort Emily hadn't known how to accept. And then, Emily pulling away, ignoring texts, letting friendship fade into silence. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again," Megan admitted, her voice careful but not unkind. "Yeah," Emily exhaled, looking down. I owe you an apology. I pushed you away when I needed you the most, and that wasn't fair." Megan's expression softened, her arms crossing over her chest. "I didn't understand why you shut me out. I wanted to be there for you." "I know," Emily whispered, shame creeping in. "But I convinced myself that if I let anyone in, it would hurt more when they left. So I left first." Megan was quiet for a moment before stepping closer. "Emily, I never would have left." The words settled deep, cutting through the lies Emily had believed for so long. Not everyone walks away. Not everyone gives up. She blinked back the sting of tears. "I know that now." Megan studied her. Then, with a small smile, she opened her arms. Emily hesitated only a second before stepping forward, letting herself accept the embrace she had once refused. It was familiar, warm, filled with the kind of love she had spent too long running from. "I missed you," Megan murmured. "I missed you too," Emily admitted, meaning it with her whole heart. Later that evening, as she walked back through town, she spotted Liam standing near the coffee shop, watching her with a knowing expression. "You okay?" he asked as she approached. Emily nodded, the weight in her chest replaced by something new, something light. "Yeah," she said, surprising herself. "I think I am." Liam smiled, and for the first time, Emily realized he saw what she was only beginning to understand. Her walls were finally coming down, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Snow crunched beneath Emily's boots as she walked alongside Liam, their breath forming soft clouds in the crisp evening air. The town was quiet, the glow of streetlights casting golden halos over the snow-dusted sidewalks. She had never noticed how peaceful winter nights could be. How still, how full of quiet wonder. It felt fitting, somehow, to be here now. On the other side of so much doubt and fear, finally able to breathe again. "You've changed," Liam said after a while, his voice thoughtful. Emily glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" "Yeah." He slid his hands into his coat pockets, his gaze steady. "I've seen it in the way you talk, the way you carry yourself. It's like you're not holding your breath anymore." She let his words settle, realizing they were true. She had spent so long waiting for the next heartbreak, the next disappointment, afraid to hope, afraid to believe in anything good. But now there was peace, fragile but real, like the first traces of dawn after a long night. "I think I finally understand," she murmured, kicking at a patch of ice. "That God's love was never about what I could prove. It was always there, waiting for me to accept it." Liam smiled, nodding. "That's a big thing to learn." "Took me long enough," she smirked. But there was no self-condemnation in it, only quiet amusement at how stubborn she had been. "Hey, God's timing," Liam said with a shrug. "It's always better than ours." There was something in his tone, something deeper, almost hesitant. And when Emily looked at him, she caught the flicker of something unspoken in his expression. A warmth spread through her, unexpected but not unwelcome. She had known Liam for years, but now she saw him differently, not just as a childhood friend, but as someone who had walked alongside her in this season of renewal, someone who had seen her at her worst and never turned away. But instead of fear, instead of the instinct to run, she felt something new. Peace. Maybe for the first time she wasn't afraid of love, because love, real love, wasn't something to be earned or clung to in desperation. It was something to trust, something to surrender to in God's perfect timing. As they walked on, the thought settled deep, gentle but sure. She wasn't in a hurry to figure out what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. That night, as she knelt beside her bed, she whispered a prayer, not one of desperation or doubt, but of quiet surrender. "God, whatever you have for me, I trust you." And for the first time in years, she meant it. Emily stood at the front of the church, gripping the microphone with trembling fingers, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The sanctuary was full, yet the moment felt intensely personal, as if she were standing before God alone, offering him the story she had once been too ashamed to tell. She hadn't planned on speaking tonight. When Pastor Daniel had mentioned the open mic for testimonies, she had shaken her head, convinced she wasn't ready. But then she remembered the quiet whisper in her heart, the one that had followed her for weeks now. "Tell them what I've done for you." So here she was, standing in front of the same congregation she had once avoided, taking a leap of faith she never imagined making. She swallowed hard and took a breath. "For a long time, I believed I wasn't enough," she began, her voice soft but steady. "That love, God's love, anyone's love, was something I had to earn. And because I kept falling short, I convinced myself I wasn't worth it. I spent years running, shutting people out, shutting God out, thinking he had already given up on me." She exhaled, her gaze sweeping across the room. No one looked away. No one shifted uncomfortably. They were listening. But the truth is, he never left, she continued, her voice growing stronger, even in the silence, even in my anger. Even when I wanted nothing to do with him, he never stopped calling me his. I see that now. And I know, deep in my heart, that nothing I have done, nothing I have believed about myself, could ever separate me from his love. Her fingers loosened around the microphone as peace washed over her. I don't have all the answers, she admitted, but I know this. God's love is real. It's steady. It doesn't waver when we do. And if you've ever felt unworthy, if you've ever questioned whether he sees you, I promise you, he does. A hush filled the sanctuary, the weight of her words settling like a holy stillness over the room. Emily released a slow breath, stepping back as Pastor Daniel gave her an encouraging nod. The moment she sat down, a woman from the back of the church made her way forward, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Emily? The woman's voice wavered. Thank you for sharing that. She hesitated, then spoke the words that made Emily's chest tighten. I needed to hear it. Emily blinked, feeling something deep and certain settle within her. This is why God wanted me to speak. It wasn't just about her healing. It was about pointing others to the same love that had found her in her brokenness. As she reached for the woman's hand, offering a gentle squeeze, she realized she had taken a leap of faith. And she had landed right where God had always meant her to be. Emily sat across from Rachel, the woman who had approached her after she shared her testimony, watching as she stirred her tea with a quiet intensity. They had met for coffee a few times since that night, and each time, Rachel had slowly begun to open up, her guarded heart unraveling in ways that felt all too familiar. Today, though, there was something different in her eyes. Something raw, searching. I just don't understand how God could love me after everything, Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've messed up so many times. I've doubted him. I've pushed people away. How can he still want me? Emily's chest tightened at the familiar ache in those words. Hadn't she once sat in the same doubt, believing the same lies? And yet, here she was. Proof that God's love had never been dependent on how well she held herself together. Rachel, Emily said gently, leaning forward. I know exactly how that feels. I believed for so long that I had to be good enough for God, that my failures disqualified me from his love. But none of that was ever true. Rachel looked up, doubt flickering in her tear-filled eyes. Then what is true? Emily smiled softly, her heart swelling with the kind of certainty she never thought she'd find. That his love isn't about what we've done or how many times we've failed. It's about who he is and who he says we are. Rachel exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of her cup. I want to believe that, she murmured, but I don't know how. Emily reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Then let's walk through it together. The words felt like déjà vu, echoing the very ones Mrs. Carter had once spoken to her. And in that moment, Emily saw it. How God had taken the broken pieces of her story and woven them into something bigger, something meant to help others heal. The same way Mrs. Carter had poured into her life. Now she had the chance to do the same for someone else. It wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about being perfect. It was simply about showing up, about reminding someone that they weren't alone. Later that night, as Emily curled up on her couch, she pulled out her old journal, the same one she had once filled with doubts, with desperate prayers she had thought went unheard. But tonight, she flipped to a fresh page, her pen gliding over, the paper with a piece she never expected to know. I am loved beyond measure. She let the words sink in, not just as something she hoped for, but as something she knew, deep, unwavering, and true. God had redeemed her story. And now, he was using it to redeem others. Smiling to herself, she closed the journal, exhaling a breath of gratitude. This was just the beginning. The sanctuary flickered with the glow of candlelight, hundreds of tiny flames dancing in the dim warmth of the Christmas Eve service. Emily sat between Mrs. Carter and Liam, the gentle hum of whispered prayers and soft laughter weaving through the sacred stillness of the night. The past year had been a journey, one filled with healing, with growth, with learning to trust a love that had always been there, waiting for her to see it. And now, as she held the small candle in her hands, its steady flame reflecting the steady faith that had taken root in her heart, she realized something she never would have believed a year ago. She was whole. Not because her life was perfect, not because she had every answer, but because she finally understood that love, real love, was never something to be earned or chased. It had been freely given, poured out by a God who had never once stopped pursuing her. As the choir began to sing "O Holy Night," a hush fell over the congregation, and Emily closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep. Long lay the world in, sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. A quiet tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't from sadness. It was from peace. From knowing that her soul, her very existence, had always held worth, not because of anything she had done, but because of the one who had called her his. She glanced over at Mrs. Carter, whose kind eyes shimmered in the candlelight, and then at Liam, who met her gaze with a soft, knowing smile. So much had changed, and yet, in the most beautiful way, things had come full circle. This time last year, she had been lost, convinced she was too far gone. Now, she was stepping into a future no longer ruled by fear, no longer haunted by rejection. She wasn't waiting for love to prove itself. She was living in the fullness of the love that had already claimed her. As the final notes of the hymn echoed through the sanctuary, Emily breathed in deeply, lifting her candle alongside the others. The warm glow illuminated every face, every story of redemption, every testimony of grace, and she was one of them. She was his. As the service ended, people slowly began to file out, their voices filled with joy, with laughter, with hope. Emily lingered for a moment, taking it all in. Then, as she stepped out into the cold winter air, she felt nothing but warmth. A year ago, she had walked away from this very church, lost in the lie that she was unlovable. Tonight, she walked forward, fully known, fully seen, fully loved, by God, by those around her, by herself, and as the bells rang out across the snowy town, she smiled, stepping into a future rooted not in fear, but in faith. The woman she had once been was gone, and the woman she was becoming had only just begun. This story is a reminder that God moves in ways we may not always understand, but his love never fails. If this touched your heart, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still happen. All glory and honor belong to Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Until next time, stay strong in faith and never stop believing.